Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we are unpacking the wildly fascinating and frankly super complex history of the world's most populous Muslim-majority country. We're talking about Indonesia. This is a nation whose very existence is basically a triumph over fragmentation. I mean, it's a massive archipelago that has somehow survived centuries of colonization, brutal wars, political purges, and total economic collapse, all while trying to forge a single unified identity. To really wrap our heads around how this incredible nation forged its identity, we're going to journey through 6 pivotal eras: ancient empires and diversity, colonialism and World War II, the fight for independence, decades of political turmoil, the Reformasi and democracy, and finally, modern Indonesia and its future.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, Ancient Empires and Diversity.
17,508. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the number of islands making up Indonesia. To put that into perspective, that spans a distance wider than the entire continental United States. Sitting right there at the crucial crossroads between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, it's a geographical setup that literally breeds profound, deep-rooted diversity.
Now, across all those thousands of islands, you've got about 300 distinct ethnic groups speaking hundreds of different languages and dialects. It's like a giant, beautiful cultural puzzle. Yet despite all those differences, nearly 90% of the population practices Islam. It acts as this massive unifying cultural thread. And what's really cool is that it didn't primarily arrive by conquest, but spread peacefully over centuries through Indian and Arab spice trade, just naturally weaving itself right into the fabric of the islands.
And the roots here run incredibly deep. I mean, we're talking about human life dating back 1.8 million years to Java Man. Fast forward to the 7th century, and you've got the Srivijaya kingdom totally dominating maritime trade. But it was really the Majapahit Empire in the 14th century, under a ruler named Hayam Wuruk, that hit a true golden age. They proved, without a doubt, that this incredibly vast archipelago could actually be united under indigenous rule.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, Colonialism and World War II.
So, as you can probably guess, the immense wealth of spices, specifically cloves and nutmeg, which back then literally only grew on a few of these islands, acted like a magnet for European powers. The Portuguese showed up first in 1511, but it was the Dutch who arrived in 1596 and systematically locked down a ruthless, total monopoly on the spice trade. This kicked off centuries of intense economic exploitation, but ironically enough, that very oppression ended up planting the seeds for a massive national awakening.
Because out of all that hardship, something truly remarkable happened. All these diverse, highly fragmented ethnic groups started to realize they shared a common struggle. So in 1928, young leaders united and made a historic, game-changing pledge. They called for a single motherland, a single nation, and a single language: Indonesian. They essentially forged a brand new national identity, built entirely out of a shared, burning desire for freedom.
But the real turning point, that came with World War II. It completely shattered the illusion that the Dutch were invincible. In 1942, the Japanese swept in and swiftly occupied the islands. Now, this was an undeniably harsh and chaotic period for the locals, no doubt about it. But it fundamentally flipped the power dynamic. The Japanese occupation actively dismantled the old Dutch colonial structures, and crucially, they actually armed and trained native nationalists.
Which brings us to Section 3, the fight for independence. The second the war ended, nationalist leaders Sukarno and Hatta knew they had a fleeting window. They seized the moment, and on August 17, 1945, boldly declared Indonesian independence. The Dutch, however, they were having none of it. Backed initially by Allied forces, they absolutely refused to acknowledge the revolution. What followed was a brutal, grueling 4-year struggle filled with fierce military aggression, a lot of bloodshed, and intense political paralysis as the Dutch desperately tried to claw back control. But the Indonesian resistance was just relentless. They would not back down. And eventually, the geopolitical tide turned. Faced with this fierce local pushback and mounting international pressure, especially from the UN and the United States, the Netherlands finally threw in the towel. On December 27, 1949, they conceded sovereignty, and the Republic of Indonesia was officially recognized on the world stage.
That triumph leads us into Section 4, Decades of Political Turmoil.
You see, independence definitely didn't mean instant stability. Post-independence Indonesia was defined by 2 drastically different, almost opposite regimes. First, you had Sukarno, the founding father. His era was hyper-nationalistic, fiercely anti-Western, and aligned with communist powers, which unfortunately resulted in a pretty chaotic, devastated economy. Then General Suharto takes over with his new order, and the pendulum swings the exact opposite way. Suharto established a heavily militarized, strictly anti-communist, and highly authoritarian regime that was laser-focused on foreign investment and rapid economic growth.
So how exactly does a country whip from one extreme to the other like that? Well, the transition between these two leaders was triggered by a highly mysterious, violently contested coup attempt on October 1st, 1965. And that single event unleashed what is arguably one of the darkest, most tragic chapters in all of Indonesian history.
750,000. That is the staggering upper estimate of lives lost during the military's ruthless purge right after that coup attempt. General Suharto's forces, along with civilian vigilantes, systematically hunted down and killed members of the Communist Party and its sympathizers throughout 1965 and 1966. It was an absolute bloodbath. It entirely wiped out the political left in Indonesia and firmly, violently cemented Suharto's authoritarian grip on power.
Let's move to Section 5, the Reformasi and democracy. Now, you might be wondering what actually triggers the fall of a dictator who has held on to power for 32 years. Well, despite bringing decades of undeniable economic development, Suharto's regime simply couldn't outrun the massive consequences of extreme corruption, unchecked cronyism, and a totally unexpected global crisis.
This whole sequence of events is known as the Reformasi movement. It basically kicked off when the 1997 Asian financial crisis completely decimated the Indonesian economy. The economic pain was just too much, sparking these massive, incredibly brave student protests in 1998, demanding an end to the corruption and nepotism. Tragically, this culminated in the horrific May 1998 Jakarta riots, where roughly 1,200 people lost their lives. But the pressure had reached a boiling point. On May 21, 1998, Sukarno officially stepped down, forcing an unprecedented, historic transition toward real democracy.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, modern Indonesia and its future. Today, Indonesia has emerged from all of that chaos as a truly resilient democratic state and a rapidly growing economic tiger. But of course, it faces a whole new set of monumental tests. While democratic free elections are the norm now, which is huge, the system is still pretty heavily dominated by political elites. The nation has to constantly navigate these really complex trade-offs, like how do you balance incredible, rapid economic growth with stubborn, extreme wealth inequality? And crucially, they are right on the front lines of global environmental crises, battling massive deforestation, losing about 0.81 million hectares of forest every single year just to agricultural expansion.
And just to emphasize why that matters to you and me, Indonesia holds a mind-blowing 20% of the entire world's biodiversity. It's home to the third largest rainforest on Earth. This means their domestic, environmental, and economic policies aren't just local issues, they are absolutely critical for the survival of our entire planet. So through all of these historical crucibles, the centuries of ruthless colonialism, the devastation of World War II, the brutal dictatorships, and those severe economic collapses, the core challenge for Indonesia remains exactly what it was back when that youth pledge was signed in 1928, maintaining unity across profound, inherent diversity.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question. How will the world's fourth most populous country balance its sweeping democratic and economic ambitions, all while protecting its totally irreplaceable cultural and natural heritage? Make no mistake, its success or failure in managing these forces is going to echo far beyond its 17,000 islands. It's an incredible story of human resilience, and the next chapter is being written right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you in the next one.